we began getting messages from them that Hamas had infiltrated not only the border, but that they were in the kibbutz and that they could hear them in the house, that they had overturned furniture and they could hear gunfire. The last messages that we have from them are a fear that they won't make it out.
As families of those being held hostage in Gaza speak out, what could our nation's plan be to rescue them?
And let's go off the wall and look back in history at American hostage rescue attempts. What was successful? What failed? What were the methods? Let's start with perhaps the most famous hostage situation, at least in modern American history, and that was the Iranian hostage crisis from the 1970s, early 1980. It's called Operation Eagle Claw. After 3,000 Iranian students took over the American embassy during the Iranian Revolution, it was left with 66 American hostages there in Tehran, Pete.
Immensely complex. And as we look at these three particular examples, it's sobering and humbling how difficult these operations are. Not just in the intelligence and identifying. In this case, we knew where they were. It was getting to them. So President Carter approved that operation. It involved all branches of the U.S. government, but it involved a massive movement deep into Iran, a place where we didn't have a lot of connections, and it got really complicated really fast.
8 helicopters took off from the USS Nimitz across the deserts of Iran, attempting to get to Tehran, where the hostages were being held.
So you had a CIA team inside the country that was meant to help coordinate this. These helicopters coming off the Nimitz didn't have enough distance in order to reach where the hostages were. So there was a refueling site set up in the middle of the desert. In fact, they encountered a tanker. They had to shoot it with an RPG. I mean, it got really... And then eventually, fuel was running low in multiple of those helicopters. One was not mission capable. And in the middle of a sandstorm, Will, they had to try to reposition the helicopters. And that's when tragedy struck.
Yeah, these sandstorms reduced it to no visibility. The helicopter blades hit one of the refueling stations and it crashed and killed several Americans. And it was an absolute national embarrassment because the Iranians used it as a huge piece of propaganda.
Yeah, they had to leave the helicopters behind, many of which they were not able to destroy, had classified information inside them. 8 U.S. service members killed, no hostages rescued, obviously. The hostages were later released after negotiation, but also on the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, who had a very different approach.
On the day of inauguration of Ronald Reagan.
Again, it was really complicated. The best of the best trying to get to those Americans weren't able to make it happen.
Speaking of the best and a mission that did not succeed, in 2014 in Yemen, a freelance photographer, Luke Summers, was taken and held hostage after the uprising in Yemen, one that still continues to this day, by the way, in the form of a civil war in Yemen. He was there and held hostage from September 2013 until this rescue attempt in December of 2014.
We were able to eventually track him to a walled compound in the village of southern Yemen. There was one attempt that failed, so his captors knew that they were tracking his location and that the U.S. would try again. SEAL Team 6 commandos, joined by a small number of local forces, went in, and as they approached the village, their positions were effectively given away. It was impossible to approach that building without being heard.
It was within 100 yards. The commandos were within 100 yards of the compound. No real knowledge on how they were discovered, but they were discovered. A firefight ensued. Enough time had then given the terrorists warning that they got to go inside where Summers and I believe two other hostages, not Americans, 2 other hostages were being held and execute. I think it was actually more. It was like 11 hostages.
There were 11. And ultimately, the American is what we were focused on. And in this case, you're right. They knew the commandos were coming, and so they specifically went to the building where the captives were, shot them, and then fled.
Yeah.
Which, again, shows you this is more of a rural area. Shows you how complicated just the approach is to the location, let alone on target. Because if you get SEAL Team 6 on target with these guys, it's not a fair fight. You got to get there in the process.
So then let's move now to Iraq, 2015. 70 hostages. These were the hostages in this situation, I believe, were mostly Kurdish allies of American forces.
No doubt, stranded, surrounded, imminently to be executed. And so we worked alongside Iraqi Peshmerga and special forces to try to rescue 70 of those who, remember these days of ISIS? I mean, when they would get civilian populations, they would herd them together, and if they weren't with them, they were against them, and they were soon to be executed. So America jumped in. Again, this wasn't to rescue Americans, but it was an American-led operation.
Yeah, and they ultimately rescued 70 Kurdish hostages. I think they pulled a group of 40 out of prison cells, blew those prison cells, found another 30 in a building that was ultimately falling, burning, and destroyed. But in the firefight, Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler was shot and killed during the rescue attempt.
And like everything else, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. They weren't able to get their dynamic entry didn't work. They had to blast a hole in the side of the compound, which alerted the ISIL militants. Then they had a firefight. They had to get bolt cutters to get them out. And we did lose one great American during that rescue.
The objective was a success. I think the point of going back into history and looking at these hostage attempts is just, again, as you started out, to highlight the difficulty. And in this situation, inside of Gaza, 150 hostages, 15 Americans. This one, I can't speak, but seems on a difficulty level at a 10.
Beyond a 10.
Well, on a scale from 1 to 10 was in my mind. Yes.
I get what you're saying. No, it is. And in these cases and these are just 3, we could have picked a lot of other ones. The enemy didn't necessarily know who was coming or when, but in the Gaza Strip, Hamas is prepared for the eventuality of this while surrounded by a population at least complicit with their activities, maybe not of their own volition.
Yeah.
And hostages underground, including above ground. Our prayers go for those that would attempt such an operation. And we don't know if Americans would be involved either.
No.
It could be an IDF-only operation. We're just talking about American operations. All right, right now, Israeli forces prepare to attack Gaza by air, land, and sea.
Meanwhile, here at home, University of Pennsylvania donors demand leadership resign for hosting a Palestinian Writers Festival. We talked to Jewish model and activist Elizabeth Pipko, who went there and is speaking out.